As Jen so kindly said, my name is Alex Thompson. I live here in the Cleveland area. I run a blog called The Same Old Zen, and I'm studying to become a Buddhist lay minister in the Bright Dawn Center of Oneness Buddhism. So essentially the reason I'm here today is I'm going to tell you about why I became vegan. A lot of people ask me that question. They also ask me why I became Buddhist. And the two reasons are essentially the same, in that I wanted to end my own suffering and I also wanted to end suffering in the rest of the world. So when people ask me, why are you vegan? I say it's because of my Buddhist practice, because it is. And I'll talk to you about that intersection. I'll also talk to you about my experiences living and working on organic farms that were quote-unquote humane, quote-unquote sustainable, and why that led me to the conclusion that there is no sustainable, there is no humane way to raise animals for meat, for agriculture, for any reason. At a Christmas party that I was attending in Indianapolis, and at that point in my life, I was living the quote-unquote American dream. I had a Mustang, I had a really nice apartment in the quote-unquote good part of town, cushy corporate job, and despite what you see in this picture, I was completely and utterly miserable with my life. I hated getting up in the morning, I hated going to work. I couldn't tell anyone why I was unhappy. I had everything that society told me I should be making me happy, but I wasn't. So for that reason, I decided to start searching for a spiritual path, and that led me to Buddhism. Next slide, please. So this is me. When I first started practicing, I did so with the Quantum School of Zen, and this picture was taken with me and the rest of my song of the day I took the precepts, which is the ceremony you go through when you decide you want to officially convert to Buddhism. So the Chongdo that was in my name earlier is Korean. It stands for clear path, and that's the name I was given when I took the precepts and became Buddhist. Now the reason this is important and why it has anything to do with our story is that in Buddhism we have something called the Bodhisattva vows. A bodhisattva in Buddhism is an archetype that we use as an example of how we should live our lives. So for example, there's Kuan Yin, the bodhisattva of compassion, who emanates compassion for all sentient beings in the world and listens to their cries of suffering. There's Jizo, the bodhisattva of hell beings, who lives in hell with the demons and has taken the vow that he will not leave hell until all the demons can leave with him, until they've been liberated from their suffering. So the idea in Buddhism, again, is we want to end our own suffering, but we also want to end the suffering of others. Now, at this point, I've been practicing for about a year. The practice was very much a part of who I was, still is, and it was very life-changing for me. What changed this day, however, is I really started to think about what my vows meant and whether or not I was living up to them. The Bodhisattva vows state, sentient beings are numberless, I vow to save them all. Delusions are endless, I vow to cut through them all. The teachings are endless, I vow to learn them all. And the Buddha way is inconceivable, I vow to attain it. Now, the key one here is the first one, sentient beings are numberless, I vow to save them all. Obviously, that's an impossible vow. If beings are numberless, how can we save everyone? And we can't. But the vow isn't that we'll save literally every person, the vow is that we'll try. So then I started to question myself and ask myself, am I living up to this vow? Another incident that happened very early in my practice, but it only really clicked for me this day, was that it was very common before we started meditation that people would congregate in the kitchen and if we brought food with us, we'd eat, we'd talk, etc. Well, there was a steakhouse not too far from the Zen Center. So I went there, I got my steak, my potato, my broccoli, whatever. I come into the Zen Center, I open up, I start eating, not thinking anything of it. And a senior student, very politely, but very, very firmly said, you can't eat that here. And the reason being that this Zen Center, like most Zen Centers, are vegetarian, keeping with the Bodhisattva vow. So That didn't make me go vegan that day, but again, it made me start thinking, what am I eating? Why am I eating? What's the effect of what I'm doing? And as I started to learn more, research more, I realized that our farming in the United States is just absolutely horrible. Conventional farming is extremely dangerous to the environment and to our health. So I made the decision, because again, I hated my corporate job at that point, that I was going to quit my job and I was going to work on an organic farm. Because I wanted to live sustainably, I wanted to live in a way that was light on the land, and I wanted to live in a way that was good for me and all other sentient beings. Now, the issue here was I recently watched Cowspiracy. So through that, I realized that vegetarianism, while on the spectrum of suffering, one could argue is not as bad as a completely omnivorous diet, obviously isn't perfect. Far from it. But I didn't know any vegans at the time. I honestly wasn't convinced that I could be healthy as a vegan. So I decided the middle path for me was that I was going to be vegetarian, but I was going to find a way to do it in a healthy manner, in a way that was humane for the animals. Next slide, please. So, quit my job, already told you that. And I decided that I was going to live in community with people. So the first farm I lived on was one in Indiana. Next slide, please. And it was a mixed-use farm. So what they did there is they grew vegetables, obviously. They also had a series of tiny houses there. And the idea was that we were going to live lightly on the land, we were going to live sustainably, we were going to live in community. So you could come here, if you wanted to raise goats, you could raise goats. If you wanted to raise bees, you could raise bees. If you wanted to do vegetables, you could do vegetables. But you could have all these different farm businesses on the property, and then we kind of have our own internal economy that way. Now, I wasn't a farming apprentice, so I wasn't growing vegetables at this point. I was actually a building apprentice. Next slide, please. So I was working on the tiny house, as you can see here. Which is a really cool process. We used nothing but sustainable. Everything was either reused or it was sustainable. So the cedar we got from a wood mill that was right down the road. We used clay slip for the sides. We used earth bags and a rubble trench for the foundation and the walls, respectively. So it's a very green project. The insulation and the roof was taken from a building that was being torn down. So I was living lightly on the land in that way, but there were still problems, which I'll talk about here in a moment. Next slide, please. That's the house where it's pretty much finished. Next one, please. Thank you. So the first time I realized there was a problem was when I met the pigs. Now, at the farm, we had pigs, we had chickens, and we had cows. Now, the pigs were probably my favorite animal there. For a number of reasons. One, pigs, if you've never dealt with them, you're essentially dealing with a dog-like level of intelligence. Actually, they've been shown to be smarter than dogs. They learn their name. They know what time it is when they're supposed to be fed. They're very clean. There's this idea that pigs are these filthy, disgusting animals. Well, yes, if you put a pig in a pen with its own feces, it's going to be filthy and disgusting. But if you give them room to run around and play, they're actually very clean. They pick a spot to use as their quote-unquote toilet, and that's where everyone goes to pee and poop. Nobody else goes there for any other reason. So they're extremely intelligent. And living and working with these animals, feeding them every day, I realized that these are dumb animals. The idea behind my vegetarianism, frankly, at that point was very paternal in nature. I didn't really respect them as sentient beings. I just saw them as, well, you know, it's a nice thing to do, but, you know, if people don't want to do it, that's cool too. And it wasn't until I actually interacted with them every day and, again, realized that they have names and family relationships that I really started to see them not just as pigs, but as individuals. There was another incident that happened there that really, really struck at me. And remember, I was vegetarian at this point, so I wasn't eating steak, I wasn't eating bacon, anything like that. But obviously, animals were being raised here, and they were being slaughtered here. Now, the deal I made with myself in my head was I'd work on a farm that raised animals, but I wouldn't take part in the slaughter. And I know that sounds weird, but it made sense to me at the time. So that's what I did. And one of the pigs, not this one, but one of the pigs was slaughtered while I was there. And the way that hit me emotionally was what really made me realize that how special these animals really are, how valuable their lives are in comparison to ours, that their lives and their worthiness are the same. And this isn't just an environmental issue or a let's be nice issue. This really is an issue of social justice in a lot of different ways. Unfortunately, I had to be on the property at the time of slaughter for that to happen, but I did learn that lesson. Now, at this point, however, I was still convinced, because again, I wasn't eating pigs, so in my head, okay, I'm going to have my organic, sustainable farm, there won't be any pigs, but we can still do eggs, we can still do milk, right? I can make that work, I can get all the protein and nutrition I need that way, we can do it in a humane and healthy way. But as I lived there longer, I realized that wasn't going to work either. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, the other animals we worked with were the pigs. This obviously isn't an actual picture of the pigs on the farm. I didn't have any, or cows, sorry, on the farm. I didn't have any on my phone. But point being, we had several cows there that were beef cows. Now, what's special about cows when it comes to animal agriculture is they're probably the ones that people are shown the most in terms of factory farms and how terrible the conditions are. So they're the ones that people are most familiar with. Now, anyone who has or has not seen the conditions inside of a factory farm will tell you factory farms are terrible. They're horrible, they're scary, we need to get rid of them. But organic farms are okay, right? Sustainable farms are okay, right? Because then the cows are out in the grass and they're healthy and they're happy. And one thing that I heard over and over and over again while I was working on these farms is our animals only have one bad day, which is incredibly paternalistic. But that's the thinking there, is that yes, they die and it sucks, but they're very happy otherwise, and it's cool. But it's not cool. And the reason it's not cool rather, are for a couple of reasons. I won't go into all of them, but the first problem with cows and sustainable farming is that it doesn't work. When you have a cow, or just think of a bison or a wildebeest, these are free-roaming animals that range over hundreds of miles every year. So you take the animal that's usually going hundreds of miles a year, you put them in a tiny pen. Okay? Now, their hooves destroy the grass. Like, they tear it up. And it's fine if they're moving from place to place, but when they're in one place, that creates incredible soil erosion. So that's when the runoff goes into the rivers, it pollutes everything, the grass gets destroyed. So it's very bad from an environmental standpoint there. The other issue is the land use. And this is an issue that sustainable farmers never want to talk about. One cow requires, at minimum, 2 acres of pristine grassland, like just pristine grassland for one cow. Anything less than that, you have to feed them something else. Grain, hay, etc. Now, that's pristine grassland. There's not much of that left in the United States because most of it has been destroyed by cows. So if anyone here has ever traveled through the flyover states, Montana, Idaho, etc., what you see these giant tracts of land, and there's 3 cows there. Why? Because once the grassland has been destroyed, it takes anywhere from 35 to 50 acres per cow. So think about that for one moment. 50 acres for one animal. No horses can live there, no coyotes can live there, no people can live there. So when you hear about all these wild horses being killed for grazing for cows, that's why. Because they need the grazing land. So why are cows in factory farms? Because we can either do that, or we can give them 50 acres of grassland, or we cannot eat them, which is the ultimate solution. But in this particular farm, with sustainable farming, we had about 5 cows, and the idea was to be sustainable, but it wasn't actually sustainable because one thing you often hear about with sustainable farming is the closed loop system. So we're going to have animals, and we're going to have plants, and we're going to have it all in one area, and they'll all feed off each other. Nothing will come into the farm. Everything will be grown inside of it. And that's impossible with animal agriculture because, like I told you, cows need a minimum of 2 acres of pristine grassland. Usually, on average, it's closer to 5 to 10. Also, winter happens. So what are they going to eat when the snow hits the ground? So now hay has to come from somewhere. Grain has to come from somewhere. So automatically the closed loop system is out the door. Water is another big thing. A lot of times with sustainable farming, what you hear is you just need an unpolluted, crystal clear stream running through, and then the cows can drink from that. But that doesn't exist anywhere. Okay, so for here, for example, I literally had to stand out there for about 30 minutes with a hose filling up the trough for the cows to drink. So that's a lot of water every day. So this closed loop fallacy that we often hear about organic farming, sustainable farming, I've been there, it doesn't exist. Grain has to come from outside, hay has to come from outside. That's all land that could be used to be feeding people. It's feeding cows instead. The water has to come from somewhere, which means we're draining rivers, we're draining lakes, so that we can eat steaks and hamburgers. So it doesn't work. The other thing I noticed about cows as well was, again, their intelligence level. They learn their names, they know what time it is to be fed, they're extremely social, extremely clean animals. They're living beings just like we are. They think, they act, they emote just like we do. So the idea that our cows are treated well and they only have one bad day, in my opinion, if that's not okay for people, it's not okay for cows either. And going back to the Bodhisattva vow, I had to think again and again, if these animals can suffer just as much as I can, then they should be treated with the same level of dignity that I want to be treated. And that doesn't happen with sustainable farming. Is it as bad as factory farming? No. But that's like saying drowning isn't as bad as being burned to death. It's kind of a ridiculous question. I don't want to be eaten. Cows don't want to be eaten. If we can live without eating them, we should do that. And we can. Next slide, please. So the other animal we had, the final animal, was the chickens. Now, the chickens were there primarily to lay eggs. Now, the issue around chickens, there's a lot of issues around chickens. The first being that, just like cows, they're largely roaming animals. So, a lot of times what you hear, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, is that our chickens are free range. Well, there's really no such thing as a free range chicken, because in this farm in particular, they try to do that, like truly free-range chickens. They don't have cages, they don't have coops, they go wherever they want to go. And what we found was that's just not a sustainable model for raising chickens, because one, it's impossible to protect them from predators. Two, they get lost, they get injured. So what ends up happening? You have to put them in a pen, which is, these chickens were kept in a pen. So now we have chickens, they're in a pen, they're laying eggs, they're safe, that's great. Well, what people don't understand about eggs, and what I didn't personally understand, is that chickens don't just naturally lay eggs every day. When a chicken lays an egg, it's essentially like a woman giving birth. Okay? So if you can imagine what it would be like for a woman to give birth every day, that's the trauma that a chicken goes through. So it's a huge depletion of nutrients. It's a huge drain on their health. A lot of these animals suffer from osteoporosis as a result. Also, they don't do that naturally. Okay, so a wild bird, for example, they may lay an egg once a month, maybe once every couple weeks, depending on the diet. What happens with the chickens is when they're bred, so that they'll lay eggs way more often than they normally would. And then two, they're getting special grain that has very high calcium content. And what that calcium does is it overloads the chicken system. They have to get rid of it somehow, so they lay more eggs, which again leads to osteoporosis and the other health problems. So here I was on a sustainable organic farm where we treat our animals well, and yet I found that we're dealing with chickens that have been bred to have health problems already because they're laying eggs more than they need to. And two, we're feeding them special grain to make them lay even more often. Now, this is another issue why sustainable organic farming isn't a solution to our problem of animal agriculture. Because if you go to a grocery store, for example, a dozen eggs probably cost you, what, about $3? If we're talking about the organic good stuff. Well, of that $3, a farmer gets about 50 cents. The rest of it gets eaten up in cost. So if I'm a farmer, I want to make money from eggs. How do I do that? By producing as many eggs as I possibly can, which means these animals get pushed way beyond their limits as far as egg production, which hurts them, drains them, but puts a lot of money in the farmer's pocket. So if we're going to eat eggs, again, why do factory farms exist? It's not because farmers hate chickens. It's because that's the fastest, most effective way to create eggs. We have the sustainable model. Is it better? I hesitate to use that word, but the fact is, like, these animals are still being pushed way beyond what they should be doing naturally, and the end result is still the same. The other issue I saw here, because the thing I couldn't wrap my head around, I couldn't figure out, is like, okay, so we have the females, they lay eggs anyway, right? So I'll just treat them really nice, they'll lay eggs, I'll eat the eggs, but I'll treat them well. Well, that didn't work for the reasons I just told you. It also didn't work because chickens sometimes hatch male eggs. What do we do with those? So I'm sure we all know what happens to male chicks in factory farms. They get ground up, they get suffocated, all kinds of terrible things. Why does that happen? Well, male chickens don't lay eggs. So automatically, they're worthless. And I use that word because when we're looking at the capitalist model, we're not dealing with living animals here. We're dealing with commodities. We put a price on them. And I'm thinking profit loss. How long can I keep this female producing? As long as she keeps making me money. Males, they're not making eggs, they're not making me money. So what do I do with a male chick if it's a baby? In a factory farm, I kill it right off. In a sustainable farm, I let it stay around a little longer. But here's the problem. Roosters are very aggressive. They fight each other, they try to mount the females constantly. So if you keep them around, once they reach sexual maturity, they destroy each other, they destroy everything. They stress out the females, so the females stop laying. Again, costs me money as a farmer. They're not that good to eat. The reason being that because they're male, they have testosterone levels. There's a lot of muscle there, not a lot of fat. So I can't sell the meat because no one wants to buy it. I can eat it myself, but the best solution is to just kill them when they're babies, which sadly is what happens. So again, if we want eggs, that's the reality of the situation. Like, I really tried hard to find a way around it, but it doesn't work. Even if you separate them, the males will fight each other. If you give each male their own pen, they'll not have to feed them. Remember, I'm feeding them grain. Grain costs money. I only make 50 cents every dozen of eggs. So that's just the reality of farm life if I want to raise eggs. So now eggs are out and milk is out. I didn't go into milk, but I'll go into milk a little bit later. Next slide. So after that farm, I was basically giving up hope at this point that I could find a good way to do vegetarianism, but I was still going to try. I was going to do it once more. I called around to a lot of different farms, and I wanted to do another internship. I wanted to keep living this lifestyle. I wanted to live lightly on the land. How am I going to do that? Well, I called around to a lot of different farms. Before I get into this farm, I want to tell you about the experience I had at another farm. This one was located in Oregon. Again, it was a sustainable farm. But she was very clear. She's like, look, I understand your beliefs, I respect them, but I'm running a business. If you're going to live and work here, you're going to help with the slaughter. And if you'll remember from earlier, that was the one thing I did not want to do. So then she walked me through it, exactly what happens when you take part in the slaughter on a sustainable organic farm. And my thought was, it's a sustainable farm, it's a lot better than what you see in the videos, right? No, it's not. It's pretty much just as bad. It was something like out of a Saw movie. You know, she's telling me about the evisceration table and the hooks, and et cetera, et cetera. So I decided I didn't want to go live in Oregon. I came to New York instead. This was an herb farm. Her idea was that she wanted to grow her own fruits and vegetables to put into jams, jellies, teas, etc. So we grew mushrooms here, strawberries, anything that goes into jam or tea, we grew it. We also did chickens as well for eggs. Or not for eggs, these were meat birds. Next slide, please. So these are the baby chicks. We had about 50. And you'll notice they're in a very small container with a heat lamp. And this thing right here is what they were fed out of. Now, why are there 50 of them in this really tiny freaking container? Well, normally what would happen is they'd be living with their parents. They'd live under their mother's wing, and their mother would keep them warm. At this size, their feathers aren't built out enough to keep them warm on their own. They have no protection against predators, and their mothers are dead. So that's why you need the heat lamp. That's why you need to keep them in these cramped conditions. And just seeing that every day, part of my job every morning was to go in, feed them, clean out their pen. And again, going back to the Bodhisattva vow, do I want to live this way? No, I don't want to live this way. It just didn't feel right to me. Like, that's the best I can tell you. But that was their life early on. Next slide. And then this is their life when they're older. Now, the thing you have to understand about meat birds is, just like egg-laying birds, is they're not quote-unquote natural. And what I mean by that is they're bred to produce meat. So these animals grow about 8 times faster than a normal chicken would. I think a normal chicken, if I remember correctly, takes anywhere from 12 to 14 weeks to reach maturity. They reach maturity anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks. So they grow extremely fast. As a result of growing that quickly, it puts tremendous strain on their heart. A lot of times they fall over dead from heart attacks. And also, I mean, they're basically morbidly obese. Like, if they were people, they'd probably be about 400 pounds. Now, why is this an issue? Because, well, first off, I want to point something else out before I go there. What you see right here, what they're standing in, is a mixture of straw and their own feces. Part of my job, again, still was give them food, give them water every morning and every afternoon. The straw costs money. The reason their straw isn't changed out every day is because the straw costs money. There's no way around that. So again, farmers, small margins. Do I want the chickens living in their own feces? No, but I can't afford to buy new straw every day. So it's, again, just the situation. Whether it's a sustainable farm, a factory farm, that's what has to happen, is they have to live in their own feces for a while in order for us to keep costs down. Next slide, please. And then this was the pen they had outside. Now, these were free-range chickens, which meant they were allowed to run around outside. Now, the thing I realized when I was there is that the free-range, it's a myth. It doesn't exist. for a couple reasons. First, the animals are morbidly obese, so they can't walk very well. You'll notice they're all like kind of gathered around. They pretty much wouldn't move from those same spots all day, just because they couldn't. You know, they're big, they're tired, they take a couple steps, they fall down. So when you hear about free-range chickens, okay, yes, they have access to the outdoors, but how much access? This is actually pretty decent as far as free range goes. I found out that a lot of times it's a pen and then they have concrete that they can walk around outside on. So by sustainable organic standards, this was actually pretty nice, but again, they don't walk around very much because they can't. Also, you'll notice the electric fence around, so they're free range, but not really. Now, the thing about the fence, you may say, well, why don't we take the fence down? Well, again, because they get injured, they get lost, they get stolen, they get eaten by predators. The only way to keep them alive long enough for us to sell them is to keep them within the pen. Do I want to live inside an electric pen? No. Now, another thing that I saw here, we did not personally have a milk cow, but another farmer did who was also on the property. And I have a picture of this, but one thing you'll probably notice about milk cows is that they don't have horns, which is strange because regularly cows have horns. Why is that the case? Because, and this is another thing that really bothered me when I saw it. When I first got to the farm, there was a cow there that was bleeding from both sides of her head very profusely, and I didn't understand why. The reason being was that the horns had been cut off. Now, normally this would be done while they're babies, when it's quote-unquote less painful, but this was done when she was full grown because the farmer who owned her previously hadn't done it. The reason that's necessary is because if I'm a farmer, I'm milking a cow, the last thing I want is this cow with horns swinging its head around. It might hit another cow, it might hit me, it's not safe. So for the farmer's safety, what do? They cut the horns off. Now, the problem there is that these horns, like this is essentially bone. Like this is a sense organ. So there are capillaries there, they can feel things, it's extremely painful for the animal. But if you want to get milk, you want to get it in a safe way, you can't have a dairy cow with horns. It just doesn't work. So at that point I realized the milk was out. Next slide, please.
I think
that's it.
Shows that's it. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So at this point, I realized that vegetarianism wasn't going to work for me because I could not find a good way to raise the animals in a way that I felt good about. I didn't feel good about cutting the horns off of a milk cow. I didn't feel good about raising chickens that were morbidly obese, that couldn't walk, that were fenced in inside an electric fence. I didn't feel about culling male chicks because they were male. And I realized as a result of actually living and working on these farms with the animals that there is no way around that. This is just the suffering that's built into this system. And if I was going to be a part of this system, then that was something I had to deal with. So that's when I moved to Cleveland, and I decided that I was going to be vegan because I didn't want to be a part of that any longer. So that's it for the presentation. Does anyone have questions? Sure.
So I see some people like on the west side, they have their own little chickens for eggs. Are they feeding them with calcium too, you think?
Yeah, the grain, I can almost guarantee the grain that they're feeding them, it has calcium in it. Because the whole point is to get them to produce, right? And the way you get them to produce is to give them special grain. Now, whether they know it's that or not, or whether it's just chicken feed, that's what it's doing. It was actually a really big deal when I was in Indiana because someone had accidentally given the pigs chicken feed, and I guess if you give pigs too much calcium, it can damage them in a certain way. And that's how I found out that the chicken grain is special and for what reason. The other issue with backyard chickens is that you still have the issue, well, first off, the backyard chickens still come from factory farms. Like, a lot of people don't understand that. that. Like they didn't just magically appear. They had to come from somewhere. They had male brothers who were killed because nobody wants to buy male chickens. A lot of it comes down, frankly, to just the economic cost with the animals. So, yeah, to answer your question, I can almost guarantee the feed has calcium in it. And then also the idea that backyard chickens are somehow more ethical is wrong, because the same thing that happens to male chickens on the farm happens, it just happens before the people get their egg-laying hens. Yeah.
The whole, maybe this is the whole regulatory system, but, I walk by, the meat counter at any grocery store, it says humanely raised, and so I always wonder, what are the regulations, if there are any, that allows one to label something as humane,
Yeah, that was actually one of kind of the heartbreaking things I found out when I was doing this, is that a lot of the organic and the sustainable, humanely raised, it's a lot of BS, frankly. Not just from a vegan perspective, just as far as how the regulations are done. Because there are a lot of certifying bodies that have different regulations. So you can do a lot of different things and still be a humane farmer. So for example, with free range, if I'm a free range farmer, all that means is my chickens have access to the outside, and when they get outside, they have X number of feet of space to move around in. Now, that access could be one door at the end of a 400-foot warehouse. As long as they have access outside, it's free range. What it looks like once they get outside isn't regulated. So, is it grass? Is it a cement floor? Whatever. Again, that part's not regulated either. One of the things that actually made me go vegetarian was, because initially I was going to do humane meat, what you talked about. Like, I was only going to get the good eggs. I was only going to eat the cows that were treated well, but we had one bad day. But, trying to figure out exactly what that meant, and I've got my cell phone in one hand, and I've got the pork chops in the other, and I'm searching on my phone to try to find pictures of the cows and how they're treated. Like, it was just, frankly, easier just to not eat them and try to figure out, how they were treated, because that information is very much kept under wraps, because a lot of it is nonsense. So, like this farm was pasture raised, and that's another word you hear a lot is our chickens, our cows are pasture raised, and they have access to grass. And I mean, these chickens have access to grass, but I wouldn't really call that a good life. But yeah. The regulations really don't mean anything. Bill?
This is more of a comment than a question, but on our table out there, we have a piece of literature, a leaflet called Don't Buy the Myth, that has a website on it that goes into a lot of detail and augments a lot of what the covers. So just in case anybody's interested in reading a little more about it, that's
I have two quick questions. First question, have you seen or studied any ancient models that use sustainable farming without harming animals? We know this is just a modern way to farm. Do you think there's an older, ancient example?
Well, okay, so the thing about farming that you have to realize, and this is something I learned, is that okay, well, first off, I learned something very interesting. A lot of sustainable or organic farmers that you meet used to be either vegan or vegetarian. In fact, both of the farms I ended up working at, the owner had been vegetarian for, I think he was vegetarian for like 6 years, he said. And then this farm, the woman who owned it, she was vegetarian for 14 years. And you hear that story a lot. I used to be vegan, I used to be vegetarian. And they change for a number of reasons, and they give you a lot of different reasons. But the primary reason, I believe, is frankly just because of cost. and the business model and what it is to be a farmer in a capitalistic system. Farming was never meant to be a money-making venture. So if you look at ancient models and how people sustain themselves from farming, they had their plot, they grew vegetables for them and their family. If they raised animals, they did for them and their family. If they had extra, they may give it away or sell it, but it was extra. You know, my wife wants a dress. It was not how I was sustaining myself. So that's the real issue, is that a lot of these farmers who used to be vegetarian start doing the sustainable animal agriculture because people pay more for chicken than they will for corn. Okay? So if I have a chicken, for example, I slaughter it, I vacuum seal it, I put it in a freezer, that's good for 2 years. So I've got 2 years to make money off of that bird, as compared to a pound of spinach, let's say. Obviously, the shelf life, even if frozen, is a lot less. And frankly, we live in a country where people pay a lot less for spinach than they will for chicken. So there's that. There's also the fact of upkeep that comes into play as well with farming, which is, for the chickens, for example, my job was to feed and water them twice a day. And outside that, I really didn't think about, unless one of them escaped or something like that. So the amount of work that goes into animal agriculture versus plant agriculture is a lot less. So people who are trying to make money from farming, economies of scale, I can grow a lot more chickens with a lot less work than if I'm trying to do spinach or kale or corn, that sort of thing. That's why if you see farmers who are just doing vegetables, generally they're monocropping, which is absolutely horrible for the environment, but allows them to do 500 acres of corn. And at that scale, you're making good money. But for a small farm, I think this was the property was really big. It was 300 acres, but the farm itself was about 10 acres. On 10 acres, you're not going to be able to grow enough vegetables to really make money as a farmer, which is why she was doing chickens. Which is why the farm in Indiana, which was a little bit larger, but they were doing cows and pigs, etc. So it really comes down to money. As far as ancient systems, I think the biggest difference between them and us is they weren't doing it with the financial motivation. So for homesteading, for example, where you're not trying to sell what you grow, you're just growing it for you and your family. There are some ancient models that work. Permaculture is actually really spectacular in that way, about different ways of creating systems where you can grow stuff for yourself, which is fine. But the moment you try to grow food and sell it to other people, that's where the humane and sustainable farming almost always goes to animal agriculture, because the price point, frankly, is better for animals than for plants.
So I have two questions. I really enjoyed your presentation, and it was interesting for me to hear, a lot of this, two things were happening. You had this spiritual awakening in a way, and then you also were going around living this lifestyle, and the two were sort of happening at the same time, and the spiritual part, it's almost like you were trying to rationalize what you were doing, but the spiritual part kind of wasn't letting you do it.
Yeah.
Where I think a lot of people, they don't have that spiritual part, so they're able to rationalize, especially like on these kind of farms. Mm-hmm. So my two questions are, first of all, do you think you would have come to this conclusion without your interest and then involvement in Buddhism? And since it's such a great personal story, besides being here tonight, how are you going to spread your story?
Well, for the first question, probably not. Because I really honestly did not think of animals as anything other than being here for my use until I started practicing Buddhism, which obviously is not the way everyone comes to veganism, but for me, it just really changed my mindset. I find that because when you talk to anyone about animal agriculture or about eating animals in general, You'll hear all the excuses, I need the protein, they only have one bad day, etc., etc. But what it really comes down to is this BS argument that we're at the top of the food chain and that these animals exist for us. So a cow wouldn't be here if I wasn't supposed to eat hamburgers. Chickens wouldn't lay eggs if I wasn't supposed to eat them, etc., etc., etc. Thank you. So that's really the struggle. And for me, that changed when I started practicing Buddhism because it made me realize that I'm not the center of the universe. So it started off with people and how I treated people, but it also came down to the animals as well. And one thing I didn't really get into during the talk was just how terribly people are treated as a result of our eating animals. Because if you look at factory farms and the work conditions there, they're terrible. People aren't allowed to take bathroom breaks. People aren't allowed to report injuries or else they're fired. They're cutting themselves because the line speeds are so fast. Why are these things happening? Because if you want hamburgers at McDonald's for $1, this is necessary. Again, it comes back to the price point. I have to get so many cows through that line in an hour or it doesn't work. And if undocumented workers need to be treated poorly for that to happen, then oh well, because you want your hamburgers. So no, I don't think I would come to this if it wasn't for my spiritual practice. I do also want to make one other point before I get to your next one, is that the farmers I lived with and worked with weren't bad people. They do have a sick mentality though. And that sickness is this idea that, again, the world revolves around us as human beings. That cows, pigs, chickens are here for our use. We had an animal get sick. Some of the chickens got sick. A few of them died off while we were there in New York. And I could see in her face, like she was concerned about their personal well-being. Why then was she okay with slaughtering them? And the answer to that is, again, this idea that the world revolves around us. And that my mindset around that would not have changed unless I had begun practicing. But to get back to my original point, farmers will grow whatever we tell them to grow. They're very smart, ingenious people. If we tell them we want kale, they will find a way to get us kale. If we tell them we want corn, cabbage, spinach, broccoli, they will grow those things, and they will do it very well. But as long as we ask for eggs, as long as we ask for milk, as long as we ask for beef, chicken, etc., this is the reality of the situation. And frankly, our demand for meat can't be met with this model. So even if you're looking at this and thinking, well, it's not perfect, but it's okay, the output from these farms was horrible compared to what you see in a factory farm, like a flea on an elephant's butt. So we will never be able to get eggs for breakfast and hamburgers for lunch and steak for dinner and have it all come from sustainable farms. It won't. They sacrifice a lot of output in the name of humane treatment of the animals. So if you really care about the animals and their welfare, the only real way to do it, and I found this out for myself, is to not eat them. Now to your other question, how am I spreading my message around this? Primarily through my blog. It's called The Same Old Zen. And it doesn't just talk about veganism. It's largely about my Buddhist practice and how I use that to get through my daily life. But I do talk about veganism quite a bit on my blog. Just because it is such a big part of my life. I also take part in activities with Kara and with Food Not Bombs, which is an organization that does food shares once a week for people who live in food insecure situations. And then we only serve them plant-based meals. You had another question?
Yeah. Okay, this is maybe too forward in the future, but I want you to stick with me. It may sound like a silly question. Let's say you've gotten a lot of momentum with what you're showing and teaching, and it's spreading all over the world. There's a lot of, the documentaries she brought up earlier and different things like that. let's say a country or a state, a very small country or a state, wants to adopt what you're saying as a law and get rid of animals on the farm, and I'm like the president of the country or something, what would you say? And their question is, what am I going to do with the animals that I have here? So we've seen the problem, sustainable farming. Now what do we do?
Sure, and that's a fair question, because frankly, we've bred these animals and mutated them to the point where they can't survive on their own. These animals cannot run away from a predator. They can't. They are 100% dependent on us. Pigs, cows, a little less so, but even there, the pigs are so much bigger than they would be ordinarily that they would have trouble surviving. The cows, frankly, their intelligence has been bred out of them to the point where, I mean, I'm not saying they're stupid, but they're not as smart as they would have been if they'd grown up in the wild. So what do we do with the animals if we decide that we don't want to have, or we don't want animal agriculture? And I think the easy solution there is, one, we stop breeding them. What you don't realize for a lot of these animals is that because of the way we've bred them, a lot of them require artificial insemination. So for example, with cows, the hip bones, especially on the milk cows, have become so brittle in order to make more room for their udders to have these tremendous amounts of milk that they can't be mounted by a bull. So if we just stop artificially inseminating them, a lot of them will, quite frankly, die out on their own. Same goes for the chickens. The pigs can breed on their own, but my point is, if we stop breeding them and force breeding them, then a lot of the population will shrink on its own. And from there, we can have shelters and basically, frankly, just take care of them.
Not a zoo, because I don't.
Not
zoos
a zoo,
are okay. All right.
But we can do things like what you see at Lhasa Sanctuary, where we can have sanctuaries for farm animals, let them live out their lives, and then once they're gone, we can use the land we were using to raise the animals to grow vegetables, which is frankly a much more sustainable process and much more healthier for us and for the earth as a whole.
When you originally started your story, you were talking about how you decided to switch to vegetarianism, and you were concerned in regards to proper nutrition through a vegan diet. When you came to these realizations that these sentient beings were deserving of life just as you are, what information helped you ease your mind in regards to gaining the proper nutrients?
Sure. And that's a very fair question. A lot of people, because we're raised in a society where you have to drink milk, you have to eat eggs. Like, I honestly didn't know you could live without drinking milk. Like, I did not know that. Like, I drank milk since I was a kid. Drink milk, you'll have strong bones. I used to chug it every day after school. So the idea that I could not have milk, that I could not have eggs and still be okay. When I was vegetarian, I was very concerned about getting enough protein. So I ate a lot of cheese. I ate a lot of milk during that time in my life. And what I learned through research was that our bodies don't care where we get our nutrients from. We have to have a certain number of calories every day. We have to have a certain amount of protein. We have to have a certain amount of vitamin A, whatever. But it doesn't matter where that source comes, whether it's meat, plants, Soylent. As long as we're getting what we need, we're going to be healthy. And what I found was the only thing we can't get from plants that we get from animals is B12, which I can get via vitamin. So I was good there. And then as far as everything else, it was a pretty simple process because I'm a nerd and I'm into nutrition, of just looking at, all right, this is what I get from eggs. Eggs have, I think it's like 6 grams of protein per egg, something like that. So how much beans do I have to eat to get that same amount of protein? And just that idea of just switching it out. So when I went vegetarian, I kind of did the same thing of, all right, this is what I get from my hamburger. What plant foods do I need to eat to get that same nutrition? And I think it's very easy for people to do that. It's just swap it out. You know, there's so much research available, so much nutritional information available that it's insanely easy to just go, all right, this is what I eat now. If I want to go to a plant-based diet, what do I need to replace these things with? And it was pretty simple to do that. One thing that made the transition to veganism easier, some people like me saying this, some people don't. You can see both sides, but being vegetarian first made the transition to veganism very easy, just because I don't eat cheese anymore. Like, it wasn't really a big thing when I made that switch. It's like cutting out milk, eggs, and cheese was really all I had to do when I came back from Cleveland. And I did that pretty much without any issue at all. But to answer your question, just looking at what animal products you eat and then looking at the nutrition and switching the things out is what I did, and it worked just fine. Yes. Perfect.
I was just going to add that, again, at the table, we have a guide called, I think it says, Vegetarian Starter Kit, but it is all vegan, from PCRM that has a lot of nutritional information if anyone is interested in reading more about that.
Aren't animals, like the chickens, aren't they good for the farm in that if you have them all in this little pen, they're eating all the bugs and all, and then you move them and they eat the bugs there, and then this land is good to use for something else. And then you had the chickens, you had to clean the straw out every day, compost it, and you know, I know that the new straws cost me money, but you can use that other stuff for something else, as the feces in there and, you know, fertilizer. And then one last thing.
Sure, go ahead.
Where is your farm here in Cleveland?
Well, I'll answer that first because it's easy. I don't have a farm here in Cleveland.
Oh, okay.
I do have a garden in my backyard, but
Okay.
I'm not working on a farm currently. Now, to your other question, I'm familiar with what you're talking about. Joel Salatin is a really big in sustainable animal agriculture, and essentially what he does is what you're talking about. So he has these chicken tractors, and he has the chickens in there, and they run around inside, and they poop everywhere, then he moves it, and then the grass grows, and the cows eat the grass, and like, yes, as far as sustainable models go, I think he has the best one in terms of animal agriculture, but at that point, it stops being a humane use issue and starts being an ethical issue for me. Because you are correct, if we had the chickens and they're running around, they're eating bugs, and then we move them from place to place to place, it is very good for the farm. It's not good for the animals. Even with Joel Salatin and his chicken tractors, I mean, they're tiny. They're like this tall, 3 by 6 maybe. So it is a very good model if all you want to do is grow food and make money. But for me, coming at this from a spiritual perspective, one of the things you're always told in Buddhism is a good Buddhist looks at another person and they see their own face. So I treat other people as if they're me. So I treat these chickens as if they're me. So the question that's always in the back of my mind is, do I want to live the way they're living? And I don't want to live in a chicken tractor. So for that reason, I don't go with that model. Yeah.
To that point, my understanding is that to grow organic produce, they use blood meal and bone meal and manure from the farm animals as fertilizer. So being on these organic farms where they also grow vegetables, are there other alternatives to that where you can, because otherwise, because my understanding is if you're a vegan, you're better off not buying the organic produce because they're using all the animal waste.
Right. Okay, so that's a good question, and that you're 100% correct. So what she's talking about is plants eat animals, for lack of a better term. If you're going to grow plants, you need nitrogen, you need phosphate, you need calcium. And those come from bones, they come from blood, and they come from manure. So Joel Salatin, what he does essentially is by moving the chickens around, he controls where the manure goes. which, the nitrogen causes the grass to grow, and then the cows eat the grass, etc. So, and this is something I kind of struggled with initially, because even if you look at plant-based farms, a lot of times they'll use blood, they'll use chicken manure, things of that nature in order to grow their crops, because it's there and it's easy. That was another one of my jobs, both here and in Indiana, was cleaning out the chicken coop, putting on the compost, etc. Now, you can do agriculture without that. The reason being is we're very bad at eating vegetables in the United States. Actually, a big part of growing crops, especially plants, is cutting off the parts that people don't want to eat. And currently, what happens with most of that is it just gets thrown away. So we could be smarter with that, with this leftover plant matter, and we could use it as fertilizer as opposed to using the animal products, and it works just as well. There's a lot of organic farms that do that. Now, in terms of growing what vegetables to buy, in terms of what they're using as fertilizer, frankly, they probably, no matter what vegetables you buy, they're using some sort of animal products in their fertilizer, just because it's so readily available. We have these factory farms running, there's blood, there's bone, etc., etc. It's practically free. That's what farmers are going to use, because that's the most cost-efficient thing. So that's one thing I've kind of struggled with, but it's not really something that you have any control over, so I personally just don't concern myself with it, because it's not something I can control unless I'm personally growing the vegetables. But it is possible to do agriculture without doing that, we just don't do it currently.
I understand there are many traditions in Buddhism. I'm kind of interested to find out, what tradition you follow.
Sure.
And something about your background in Buddhism.
Sure. So and I probably should have said this at the beginning. So in Buddhism, as a whole, the issue of animal agriculture is a very, very hotly debated topic, because the Buddha himself ate meat. He had laws around it in the Vinaya as far as what could be eaten and how, but as a mendicant monk, his requirement for him and his monastic order was you eat what you're given. So they ate once a day, they only ate before noon, they went around with their begging bowls, and whatever people put in, they ate. So if they were given meat, they ate meat. If they were given vegetables, they ate vegetables. So whether or not Buddhists should or can eat meat is very hotly debated, and it kind of varies depending on region. So for example, in Tibet, in Nepal, it's a very mountainous region. They can't grow vegetables up there. It's the mountains. So they actually do eat quite a bit of animal products as Buddhists. However, they do but they try very hard to be very compassionate and to build compassion in their own hearts. They chant, they give thanks to the animal before they eat it. So here in the United States, vegetarianism and veganism are a lot bigger in the Buddhist community because frankly it's easier for us. And then there are lots of different extremes. So like if you go to Japan or Korea, the monks and the priests there are largely vegetarian, and they largely grow their own food, as opposed to Sri Lanka, where Buddhists their vows are different. They don't grow their own food. They take what's given, like the Buddha did, and so they eat meat as well. So the question of what you can and cannot eat is left to the individual as far as their own interpretation. My personal interpretation is that here in the United States, where I can pick up my cell phone and have food delivered to my house, I feel it's not ethical to not be vegan because I have a choice not to be. So if I'm eating an animal, it's not because I have to, it's because I'm choosing to, which is not okay. And so as far as my own background, I practice Zen Buddhism, and I'm a part of the Bright Dawn Center of Oneness Buddhism. So the idea with our order is we try to make Buddhism as acceptable to lay practitioners, people who have jobs, cars, etc. And also we try to give the teachings in a way that's very applicable to everyday life. So instead of focusing on the sutras so much, we talk more about how can you practice compassion at your job? How can you practice compassion with your diet? How can you live the Dharma in everyday life, as opposed to how can you be a monastic? Because the United States as a whole really isn't built for monasticism. The way I kind of came to Buddhism, I talked about this a little earlier, but I'm a former Marine. So I served in Iraq and Afghanistan. When I came back to the United States, I had a little bit of trouble adjusting, some PTSD issues. So that, on top of the issues I was having at work, not being fulfilled with my job, kind of led me down the spiritual path, which led me to Buddhism. Does that answer your question? Or?
Okay, so this is more of like an opinion type question. So I'm interested to hear your take on this because of the fact that Buddhism and spirituality is such a large part of your story and your transition to finding a vegan lifestyle. Do you worry or are you concerned that a decline in spirituality or religion, that people may not as easily find sort of a vegan lifestyle with a decline in spirituality?
I do think a decline in spirituality can play a role, just because, again, it comes down to this idea that the world revolves around me, right? And that kind of goes hand in hand with the decline in spirituality. Not necessarily institutionalized religion, but just the idea of, looking for spirituality, looking to be part of something bigger than yourself. So I think that could definitely lead to it. I think we live in a consumer society that tells us the world revolves around us, which kind of feeds into the idea that animal agriculture is okay. Now, that being said, I think veganism as a whole is such a logical solution to so many world problems that it's still gonna come to the forefront, just because it touches on spirituality, but it also touches on social justice, it touches on food justice, it touches on human rights. I didn't want to get too far into those things here because I wanted to stay focused, but there are so many other reasons to become vegan in addition to spirituality that I feel that even with that decline, veganism will still come to the forefront just for other reasons. Like I have family members, for example, who really, frankly, could care less about a pig. They don't look at a chicken and see themselves. They don't care about how cows are treated, but they care a lot about I have a lot of the cancer, diabetes, heart disease on both sides of my family. So my sister, I was talking to her about a plant-based diet for the better part of a year and a half, and it was not clicking until she found out that the casein in milk causes cancer or feeds cancer. And then from there, it was just like a wake-up call. So I feel like even with the decline in spirituality, I think veganism will still be successful in spite of that, just because it's such a logical solution and it touches on so many different parts of our societies and our lives.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Because I came from, my transition from veganism was mainly inspired by environmentalists.
Mm-hmm.
I was doing so much environmental work that I felt like I was a hypocrite if I didn't take on a plant-based diet.
Sure.
One of the side effects to the vegan diet was actually I began to feel more compassion, more connected to other sentient beings. Mm-hmm. And I wondered if you had any of that kind of transition when you went from your meat-laden diet to vegetarianism and ultimately vegan.
Sure, absolutely. And that's it's kind of one of the interesting things about this whole journey is I'm not sure what part of it was me interacting with the animals and what part of it was the amount of meditation and study I was doing. It's probably a mix of the two, but I would definitely say that just eating a plant-based diet made me calmer. I found out my roommate is a doctor, so he knows all about the nutrition and things like that, that eating meat actually makes you aggressive because of the way it's broken down in your stomach and the endotoxins that get released as a result. So I found that I was a lot calmer when I stopped eating meat, and even more so when I stopped eating eggs and dairy. So that definitely played a role. And it also played a role in that the more I looked at animals and saw me, the more I looked at people and saw me. They both went hand in hand, absolutely. Which is why I always tell people that veganism is a part of my Buddhist practice. Because I personally have a really hard time envisioning a world where people are caring and compassionate about animal welfare, where they're not also caring and compassionate about human welfare. A lot of the work I do with Food Not Bombs has showed me that the way we treat animals is 100% the way we treat people in this country. For example, I took part in a protest last year regarding deer and the deer culling that was going on the east side because the deer are eating our rose bushes, so we should kill them. And then if you look at how we treat the homeless in this country, it's pretty much the same thing. Like, we don't outright kill them, but we deny them health care. We make them sleep outside in the cold. Like, how long do you think people are going to survive in that scenario? There's a park being built right now near my house, which is right in a location where there's a homeless encampment. And nobody cares what happens to them. Just like nobody cares what happens to chickens. We want chickens, screw it, we'll eat them. We want a park, screw it, kick out the homeless people. So I definitely feel like my understanding and my appreciation of veganism has 100% helped my understanding and appreciation of human beings and vice versa. Yeah, at the farm in New York, there was a dairy operation, and I didn't personally take part in it. That was another farmer, but we worked closely enough together. I'd help him out sometimes. He'd help us, let us use his tractor in exchange. So my experience with that is the issue with dairy, or especially with milk, is kind of similar to the issue with eggs, which is, what are we going to do with the boys? Because, again, it's dollars and cents. So first off, either the baby cow gets the milk or we get the milk. It can't happen both ways, right? So what would happen on a smaller farm, when we were talking about ancient agriculture, is the mother would have the baby they'd show the calf to the mother so she'd start producing milk. They'd get what they wanted for the day, and then the baby would get the rest. Well, what happened now, again, dollars and cents, is I need as much milk production as I possibly can out of this cow. So the cows have been bred to the point where they're producing so much milk, and they have a lot of the issues as the egg-laying hens, as far as the osteoporosis and whatnot. And then with their calves, if it's a boy, it's usually killed outright because it's just not financially viable to keep it. Beef cows versus dairy cows, the meat tastes very, very different. The people like beef cow meat, they don't like dairy cow meat because of the fat. The fat levels are different. So you can't really raise it even and let it live its life before you kill it. It's more cost effective to just kill the males outright. And that's where your veal comes from. Now, as far as the females go, since we can't let them have the milk, they're taken to hutches, which you may or may not be able to see a picture of if you go back in the slides. I'll tell you when. Keep going. Go for it. No, you can't see the hutches. But behind this thing right here, which was a greenhouse, there were white hutches, which were for the female cows. So the mother gives birth, the female is taken into a hutch, isolated, which is a problem because cows, again, are very intelligent, very social creatures, and they live out their lives in this giant doghouse. And we get the milk that they're supposed to get, which is very traumatic for both the baby and the mother. So there's that. The other issue as far as dairy consumption goes is how the animals are treated. Again, the dehorning especially was really what got to me more than anything. Because, and there's no way around it, because where the stalls where these animals are milked it's very close quarters. So if the cows get spooked, they start swinging their heads animal, then they can't have horns. Now, and this is actually was kind of a big deal. How many people here are familiar with milk pasteurization? So pasteurization is essentially when you sterilize the milk in order for it to be healthy for humans to consume. Now, the reason that's necessary is because cows are almost never hand milked anymore. Back in the day, you'd go there, your hand, get the milk you wanted, right? Because it was just for you and your family. Now, again, because we're pushing production, trying to make money, we hook them up to milking machines. And because of these milking machines, they get terrible infections, pus, etc. gets into the milk. How do we get rid of that pus? Through pasteurization. So it's very, very traumatic and damaging for the cows and their udders. It's not very healthy for us because everyone's like, you need milk to be healthy. Well, all the healthy gut bacteria and everything you're supposed to be getting from milk is killed during the pasteurization process. So not only are you, stealing milk, but you're not getting any of the stuff you want to be getting from the milk to begin with, because all that, bacteria and whatnot is killed during the pasteurization process, which is kind of a big deal with sustainable farmers because, well, we don't use milking machines and we shouldn't have to follow these laws. And when I was a vegetarian, I actually we had to go at night. We went to an Amish farm and got raw milk, and it was a whole thing. We were very excited because we thought we were being anti-capitalism. But point being, there are a lot of issues with the dairy consumption, the milk consumption as well.
Alex,
Yeah.
technically we're supposed to be out of the room at 8:30, so I need to wrap things up. But